Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us to building out the LGBTIQ plus inclusive business webinar, learning about gender pronouns. Uh, Tonight, one of our main speaker is Shaina. Um, they are a queer, non-binary Haitian-American artist, designer, currently based in North Carolina. They are one of the founders as well as the designers plus tech lead of Spring Up. She's going to be telling us more about their organization, and they are also serving as creative director for their own self-made creative studio born out of Miami, Florida, called MX Design Studio. I'm excited to be in conversation with you, Shaina, and tell us more about your organization, and then let's jump um, into it.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really so glad to be here this afternoon. And so, as you mentioned, I am one of the co-founders of Spring Up. I'm also the design and technology lead. And so, Spring Up is a collective of care workers, transformative justice practitioners, liberatory educators, and coaches that are teaching the liberatory arts. So we have our own online learning platform. We also create a lot of different art learning materials for folks all over the country and world. And our mission is to cultivate a culture of consent and liberty for all through storytelling and popular education. So that's what we do. And today I'm going to be doing a presentation on gender and pronouns. So I'm going to go ahead and start to share my screen for you all. And we can get started in this on this presentation.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear and to learn more. Uh, and at the very end, we're going to open the conversation uh, with my very good friend Kay. Yeah, I'm excited to learn more.
Awesome. Okay. Let me see. Can you, oh, okay, wait a minute. Can you see my screen, the presentation? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. All right. So this presentation is called Unlearning the Binary. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the gender binary, pronouns, and some different terminology that we can learn in order to create more inclusive spaces within our communities and our businesses and our relationships overall. So this is not something just for, the LGBTQ community, but for our community as a whole. So I like to usually start off with this quote, which is was said by Alok Menon, who is a queer activist, and it reads, "Gender is a story, not just a word. There are as many ways to be a woman as there are women. There are as many ways to be a man as there are men. There are as many ways to be non-binary as there are non-binary people. This complexity is not chaos, it just is." So, this is a great way for us to begin to think about what gender is and separate it from the binary that we've been taught is the way of gender. So, we're going to start off with something that we see probably every day, right? We're all faced with this daily. The two options is the women's bathroom or the men's bathroom. We also see this come up in gender reveal parties. Someone's pregnant, and we're thinking, is it going to be a boy or a girl? In our society, what's challenging is that we are taught to view gender and sex as the same thing, and we're taught that there are only two options. What I'm going to show you in this presentation today is that this is not the case. Both sex and gender are not binary. And also, these two things are completely separate. So this is another quote by Alok that says, "It wasn't advancements in science that led to the creation of the sex binary model, it was politics." So what am I talking about when I mention this binary, right? Where did this come from? This quote by Alok gives us a little bit of a context to understanding that the sex binary and gender binary was created by us. And so this refers to the fact that even in biology, there is no binary. And the creation of these was a way to characterize people from birth into categories that could become a little bit more black and white. And this was the model that would be at the foundation for the creation of our modern Western society. And the reason that I say modern Western society is because before the creation of this modern society, non-binary cultures were in every indigenous cultures around the world. And we didn't have this binary until about the late 1800s. So moving into just, let's talk a little bit about the terminology, right? So when we pull apart what we think about as sex, gender expression, and pronouns. Um, One of the things that we think about when we're talking about sex is we're referring to biology. We're talking about the organs that we have, biological parts, and chromosomes. So, for example, when you say female, you're referring to somebody that has the biological organs of a female, and also has the chromosomes XX. And then additionally, we have male, right? These are usually, you have male biology and the chromosomes XY. Now, as we start to understand that even sex is not a binary, we see the presentation of intersex. And this refers to anybody who is born with either a combination of both female and male biological parts, sometimes presenting chromosomally as XXY, or sometimes as neither. And this can happen a lot more often than we think. It just doesn't end up being the case because a lot of the times babies are, if they're born intersex, the parents are asked to choose based on their hormone levels or which of the biological organs are more prominent. And later they are usually gone through with surgery or hormone replacement therapy and those sorts of things. Then when we talk about the gender category, we are talking about what we identify as. We're separating it from the sex, and we're thinking about these things as in woman, man, and non-binary. Now, these are very clear cut, and there's definitely so many more options within each of these categories, but this is really the basic way for us to start to think about what it looks like outside of the binary of just woman or man. So whether or not you are born female, you can identify as a woman, man, or non-binary, meaning you present both or neither. Um, and then when it comes to gender expression, this is how somebody presents. So gender expression is actually not directly related even to our gender. For example, you can be a man and present feminine. You can be a woman and present masculine. You can be gender non-conforming, meaning you don't fit into either one. You maybe show feminine and masculine qualities and identify as either of these genders in the category. So when we start to break these down and we think about, okay, when somebody is a woman, a man, or non-binary, and this is what they identify as, we usually start to think about how do we want to refer to them? And that's where pronouns come into play. Pronouns are what we use to refer to someone that directly relates to their gender and their identity. So, a lot of the times, if you have a woman, whether they are assigned that gender at birth or not, a lot of the times they're going to want to go with the pronouns she, her. If you have a man, a lot of the times you'll see them as wanting to be referred to with he, him, his pronouns. And then a lot of the times for non-binary folks, we will opt to use they, them, theirs. Now, this is where it starts to become a little bit confusing for folks, right? A lot of people say, how can we use they, them for one person? That's what we use for a multitude or like a group of people. And actually, this is something that we do every day in our lives. We refer to individuals by using the pronouns they, them without even realizing it. It's not until we bring it to the forefront of our mind that it starts to become confusing. So, for example, you pick up a wallet that was on the floor, somebody lost. You would say, oh, wow, whose wallet is this? I wonder where they might be. How can we get in contact with them? You don't know what this person's gender is, so you automatically default to using the pronouns they and them. So when we start to talk a little bit more about pronouns, and we'll kind of jump back to this a little later in the presentation, um, the default is to use they, them until you ask someone what pronouns they prefer. So just as I was saying before about sex versus gender, gender is actually socially constructed. Sex is biological, and gender is social and culturally specific. The way in which somebody is a woman in one culture is going to look very different in a different culture, right? The way that we are seeing women in this country is going to be very different from the ways in which women are viewed in Yemen, for example. And then gender expression is really the performance of what gender looks like. So when I was talking about femininity, masculinity, what that looks like can be in the way that we dress, in the way that we adorn ourselves, the jewelry that we wear, the makeup that we put on, the accessories that we add. And so I use this image here to kind of show the separation between those two. Gender is here. This is how we feel and how we identify. And it is not down there. That is our sex. What we are biologically tied to is always going to not relate to sometimes our gender. And for a lot of people who refer to themselves or identify with the same gender that they were assigned at birth are going to be considered cisgender. And people who don't identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth are going to be referred to as transgender. So this is another, I have a couple of quotes here that just kind of go through again, and I'll read them out to you. Gender is biopsychosocial in that for all of us, gender experience is a complex mix of our biology, our psychology, and the social world around us. Given that everybody's biological makeup, psychological experiences, and social context connect up in unique and complex ways, our gender really is something like a snowflake. No two of us are quite the same. And this exists all over the world, right? We are all individually unique. A man, in this country is going to be very different from a man in another country, but is also going to be very different from the man that you're sitting next to on the bus, for example, right? How you are, whether you identify whatever you identify as, it's always going to be a makeup of all of the pieces that are you. And so that gives us a little bit of sorry, that gives us a little bit of extra context as to what gender is. It's a little bit more complex than just being how we present biologically. So this is the last quote that I will share with y'all before we kind of dive a little bit deeper into pronouns. And it reads, Kids' brains develop differently depending on what activities they are encouraged into. When it comes to gender, kids learn pretty quickly which things they're meant to be interested in and which they're not. And this can easily shape a good deal of their lives, the skills they learn, and the opportunities that therefore available to them or not. When we repeat gender behaviors again and again and again in our lives, like the pitch of our voice, the way we walk, or how we respond to various situations, that way of doing things becomes imprinted on our bodies and brains. No wonder it ends up feeling natural. There is so much reinforcement that happens around us. The cultural messages we receive about what is appropriate for somebody of our gender shape which things we find pleasurable because we get a lot of rewards and approval for doing them, whereas we may be shamed and punished or ostracized for doing activities that do not meet other people's approval. Right? So this comes into play when we see things like girls like pink and they like frilly tutus, right? Now it feels like something that is inaccessible for boys because it is something that we not only teach, but we reinforce through our culture and our society. And these things, again, are culturally specific. A lot of men in other cultures do wear dresses and skirts, but that's not seen as something that is, shameful. That's what we mean by culturally specific. So we're going to shift a little bit into talking a little bit more about pronouns. And so when we are talking about pronouns, we have to think that, as I showed you that chart before, right? We saw man, male, he, him, woman, female, she, her, non binary, gender non-conforming, they, them. Now, the way in which somebody presents does not always mean that is what they're going to identify as, right? If they are feminine, it does not mean that they are a woman. And therefore, you cannot assume that their pronouns are going to be she, her. So we start off by seeing a very clear-cut example. All three of these celebrities are trans, and we see one as presenting as very feminine. She uses the pronouns she, her, hers. We see the second person as presenting both feminine and masculine together pretty equally, it seems like. And they are non-binary and use the pronouns they, them, theirs. And then we see somebody as presenting very masculine and use the pronouns he, him, his. Now, in the next slide, I'm going to show you why we can't assume what people's genders are, because our gender expression is not always correlative to our gender identity. So now here we have three additional celebrities, and the first being an actress who identifies as a woman and uses the pronouns she, her, hers, but presents very masculinely. If you were to assume that she would be non-binary and or that she is presenting masculine and therefore is a man and use the pronouns he, him, you would be incorrect. And so this is where we start to think about how to be more inclusive in our communities. We have to ask. We no longer can just assume what somebody wants to be referred to as, because we cannot assume their gender based on what they look like. The second actress we have here presents very femininely, right? And you might look and say, she looks very beautiful. When really, if you had not assumed their gender and asked, you would know that they identify as non-binary and use the pronouns they, them, theirs. And lastly, we have an artist who is presenting very femininely. And again, you cannot assume that, well, maybe this person presents feminine and masculinity, they must be non-binary. Not true. You ask and you would learn that they actually he actually identifies as a man and uses the pronouns he, him, and his. So this is where we start to break down the binary in a way in which we start to unlearn the lessons that we've been taught since birth in this society to understand that there is only one or the other. You can only refer to someone as this or that, and it only exists from birth. And this is not true. You can be born a female, identify as non binary, and use the pronouns they, them, theirs. Just as you could be born with male biological parts, identify as a woman, and decide to use the pronouns she, her, hers. It really is about the separation between gender and sex, and then using gender expression to show how expansive each of these categories actually are. So I like to kind of end the presentation with a set of illustrations to just kind of recap what it looks like when we're talking about gender and the expression of gender. So this first version of the illustration is black and white. It's what we're taught as a society to understand as gender. There is one or the other. It is black or it is white. But we know that that's not true, right? So now we have a little bit more tones added to our illustration, right? And we think about there's one, the other, and then there's gray in the middle, right? We think about it as a spectrum, but it's still linear. You've got man and woman, and non binary is smack in the middle. But in the end, that's also not true. Because just as I said before, there's so many ways to be a man. There's so many ways to be non-binary, and there's so many ways to be a woman. And so this final image is full of color and has so many different colors, and it represents what the spectrum of gender actually looks like. There are so many different ways to be all of the things. And within them, there are so many different ways to express yourself. And that way is the ways that we refer to people are also a multitude, right? I introduced y'all to 3 sets of pronouns: he, she, and they. But there are actually so many additional pronouns that a lot of folks use, especially in the LGBTQ community, who don't feel like they fit into any of those categories because it's not a binary. There aren't 3 pieces. And it isn't a spectrum that starts at one point and ends at the other, but rather it is a spectrum that is cyclical. There are so many different places on the map to be in gender, and that's where we start to begin to unlearn what it means to see this as a binary. And so that comes to the conclusion of my part of the presentation. And it really is just the beginning stages of understanding what it means to break down the gender binary, the sex binary, and really start to also approach life in a non-binary, non-dualistic way. Because so many things in our world are so much more complex than black and white. And we know that within our cultures, within our races, and it also exists within gender. So thank you so much, y'all, for listening to me and hearing me out today. I look forward to having this conversation with Kay. And just quickly, if you want to continue to learn more about my organization and what we do and how we continue to help educate people all over the world and cultivate this culture of consent and liberty for all, you can go to our website at timetospringup.org and follow us on social media at Time to Spring Up. So thank you so much.
That was amazing. I can already feel it, as you can tell in my background. So we have a lot of questions. Kay, I'm going to have you introduce yourself and then hold the conversation. Usually in this world, we have to unmute.
All right, I'm back in the world. I'm Kay Sanderson, and I'm the media director for the Southern Birth Justice Network. And I'm currently on vacation in Los Angeles visiting my mother, who, after 2 years of COVID separation, demanded that I come home. So I'm here for a lengthy stay and needed to retreat into her car in order to speak freely about my trans identity. Because for most of my 40 plus years, I really expressed myself um, very androgynously, but with clear gender markers that were acceptable to her. And I recently got the best job in the world for the Southern Birth Justice Network. And I found myself in an atmosphere where I did not need to conform. And so for the first time, you know, I stopped waxing my eyebrows. They were so perfectly shaped, and every 2 to 3 weeks, there was all of this anxiety as they started to come back in and prickle. And I'm also very hairy. Um, I have facial hair. I look just like my father. I have my father's big old hands, and I dress just like him. And so I wanted in the space to introduce a bit of my personal story, to kind of bring these concepts to home, and to allow you to see how they play out in the world that we live in, and to offer some, reflections for you to consider. Um, because anytime that I've been included, um, I felt special. I felt consideration. And you know, and usually that comes about in a setting that's familiar and with people that are familiar, our kin folk, you know. And so there's always a lot of love and a lot of warmth and feel good when we talk about inclusion. Now, when I think about the spaces where I've been excluded, you know, the coldness that comes, the microaggressions, the humiliation, the shame, the othering, the silencing, the minimizing, you know, I tend to shut down. And if I gave myself a spirit animal, it would be a turtle. Not only because my face is round, but because I hide in my little shell when I don't feel safe. And I feel like the world has really missed out because I, like many non binary people, are extremely gifted. We're extremely creative, we're extremely loving and nurturing. So if you have an image of in your mind that's contrary to that, you need to stop and think where that came from. And there is a specific place that that came from. And I don't want to call anyone out. I don't want to shame anyone. And I don't want to use words like white nationalist agenda. But a lot of why you fear, non-binary people, why the images of a drag queen with makeup that looks like a monster and bulging monsters, that's, a pedophile that's gonna, kill babies, like that all comes from a very strategic place in order to silence people like me, in order to keep us excluded in the workforce so that we can have, you know, a corporate order that's very manageable. And people like me shake things up all the time because we're big, we're bold, and we think in different ways, and that's tough to manage. And so considering that we have to work to survive, we have to make our workplaces safe. That means you have to consider. Let me just stop and think for a minute what it would feel like if I wasn't straight, if I wasn't passing, if I wasn't adopting a standard of living, that upholds power structures that elevate certain groups of the population, then you would probably be working in, a setting that really values people over profit. So if you want to figure out how to make spaces more inviting to queer people, then you have to consider people and that people are different, and to not make assumptions. And so the last thing I'll say, because I'm long-winded just like my daddy, is that in order to make queer people feel welcome, to give their best, um, to thrive, to, build up, your institutions, your corporations, your organizations, it's very simple. If you don't make gendered assumptions, we're fine. So if you're wondering about something that's happening in someone's personal life with their, husband or wife, that may be a gendered assumption, no matter how they present. If have gendered spaces, well, that's going to make non-binary people feel uncomfortable, because I certainly don't want to go in a men's room. And I certainly have had women follow me into the women's room just to check things out, and that made me feel uncomfortable too. So if anyone ever considers and has a gender neutral space for me to relieve myself, I feel loved, I feel special, I feel considered. And in the state of California, even, I'm so sorry, I'm so long-winded, but in the state of California, I was even able to get a driver's license that said non-binary. And it was so incredible, because I don't have to worry what my exchange is going to be like with law enforcement, or the confusion at TSA, or all these gendered checkpoints that I have to walk through, because it's laid out and it's clear. There's no mystery about it. So it's important to create spaces for us. And with that, I'm going to open things up to conversation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for sharing. I do appreciate that you brought the personal level into it, and I as a he, they, I can't say much but listen. So I do appreciate what you two bring to the stage. Now, in terms of inclusion in the business society, let's say I am an individual out there who's in the corporate world or in the small business world who identifies as another, but doesn't know how to come into that conversation with the business owners and so forth. How do we start that conversation?
I feel like I've already said too much.
Yeah, I could go ahead. I think that one of the things that I really wish would exist in a lot of business spaces is that for whatever upper management is in that like business, to make that something that is a norm, to ask, right, before assuming. And I think that if that is not the case, being, you know, getting the nerve to be, to stand up and say, hey, I identify as non binary, or I identify as trans, and these are the pronouns in which I would like to be referred to as, it also can start to become normalized within that space. And I think that that's what's most important, is trying to either speak up if you can. But the problem is, a lot of the times it feels inaccessible, right? Because if it's not already something that's just uh, present in the space, I know from personal experience, I am very shy to, actually speak up and say, actually, like, I don't use she, her pronouns, and just kind of like be in my shell and just take it, right? Because there's been so many spaces in which I did speak up, and that ended in discrimination or violence towards me, right? And so I think that when when we feel comfortable enough that we could speak up, but as a business person, if you are like in upper management, if you are starting your own thing, right, to start to think about those things that you incorporate from the ground up, because it's something that is important in every space. You're going to have queer people, you're going to have trans and non-binary people. They exist, they're here, and they are either going to hide if they feel uncomfortable, or they're going to speak up if the space allows for it.
Okay, do you want to add into that, or do we want to go to the second question?
Sure, I'll add on to that. Um, I think that well, before I add on to that, I want to pivot and to open up the space to um, the fact that undoing language is very difficult, and so of course there's going to be a resistance, to using pronouns. But what it does is it, helps you to be aware. It brings awareness. It brings awareness to everybody, and I feel very shy saying I'm any of those pronouns. I prefer Chief Rocker number one. But if I do have to choose a pronoun, they, them, I think works. And I'm really not offended if you say sir or excuse me, ma'am, or, you know, what you see may be very different on any given day, you know. Um, so if you're saying what's reflected back to you, it's not an offense to me, and that's another thing. All non-binary and trans people don't have the same feelings about that, so it's best to, just be cautious, um, if you're willing to do that, because if you do make a mistake, and you're cool about it, then no love will be lost, And so it's best to ask questions, not too many questions. It's best to be a part of ally circles. It's best to just observe and to not judge it and say this is stupid or why do we have to do this? And I've grown up my whole life calling a girl and a woman and a she. What is this? Because that shuts down the evolution of our species, or not even the evolution, because we've always been here. you know it just helps balance the world that we live in by allowing people to be in their nature and to express themselves as they do, organically. And so, yeah.
Thank you. I love that. Now, as a business owner, let's say I'm in the environment where I feel as if I need to open that space, like both of you said, to make the place inclusive. Um, what are some steps that I can take as a business owner?
Yeah, I can start. I think that something that I really appreciated about my own workplace was that at the beginning stage of even the application, it included a place to say what you identify as well as what is your name, right, for tax purposes, but what is the name you would like to be referred to as? And also having the space to put your pronouns. And as well as something that also was like very helpful is that everybody in their email signature puts their pronouns as well. And so I think that that's something that allowed it to feel like, okay, I'm coming into this space where I know already without asking any questions that, things are going to be open. I'm going to feel like safe here. Just small things like that by just opening it up to how would you like to be addressed, right? Because just as you were mentioning, Kay, maybe I have folks in my own organization that don't have a particular set of pronouns. They just want to be referred to as their name, right? And so they say that from the get, and then that makes them already feel included and feel welcome in that space, because we ask you before you even, have the first conversation with us. Hey, how would you like to be referred to as? And I think that like very simple question is just like a little opening space to saying like, we care, and we want to make it, a safe space for you here. So that's something that I think is like at the basic level, without having to get to, like, how do I learn more things, or like how do I do the biggest, changes to how I operate, because it's always going to be a learning process. Especially because we're so ingrained to believe, certain things. Our culture is very much like, this is the way it is, and like tries to really beat it into us. But by just starting to say like, hey, I might not be perfect at this, but this is how I would like to set up this space. I want to make you feel welcome, is like really invaluable.
I think that's a wonderful approach and a great first step. And it's a softball, it's low hanging fruit. So go for it, do it. But if you really, 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 really want to make a change and really want to be serious, there's a key word in business I know you will respond to, and that's hire a consultant. And they'll make everything very clear for you. They'll spell out, they'll do a quality assessment, they'll make recommendations. They might even interview your staff, they might, um, you know, have you take, some own personal assessments that might help you understand your biases, and how to do that. So that would be my recommendation, to hire a consultant to help you figure it out.
Thank you. That makes sense. And by the way, both of you are consultants, so that's a good thing. Lastly, the last question, it comes to more of local government. Now, I'm speaking on behalf of Myanmar, the city of Myanmar, where we believe that building community and inclusive business community instead of isolation. So we're sponsored by the city of Myanmar. How can we as a local government do more to bring the inclusivity into the cities?
Ooh. I think that I will say, put your money where your mouth is. To say, as local government, that you want to be more inclusive, don't just say it. It starts at really like making actual change, right? Like if we're saying that we want to, as the city of Miramar, be more inclusive, you can't just say, yeah, we made some changes on our website or social media or in certain events that we have, right? It has to be citywide, right? Because the moment that it's citywide, then you can spread to statewide, and then you can get, up the levels of like the government. And I have a lot of different aspects that I could add to that might get into the spicy level, like you were talking about earlier, which I won't add at this time. But I think that if we're talking about government, be about the changes in the legislature that actually include queer and trans people. Don't just make it something that is surface level, because inclusivity as at the government level, I think that it is really about not just talk. It's about action. And there's a lot of, things that we can say about, getting bills passed and et cetera, and going all that levels deep. But if you as like, as city government members, if you care to create inclusive spaces, it's also about creating inclusive legislation to actually protect, not just include, but protect queer and trans people in your communities. Because the moment in which we feel like we are safe and we are protected within that community, then we're going to feel included. And it's not just being like, hey, yes, you're welcome here. Well, am I really welcome here if the rules say, nope, only this type of, uh, certain things exist. Sorry. I think that's what I would say, is that if it's about inclusivity, it's also about protection and the safety of the people in the community.
I would add to that, if there's going to be a culture shift, there's always culture shifters. So you really have to engage artists. Before we had a plug for the consultant, I don't do that. I'm an artist, so as an artist, yeah, put some money, you know, hire us to do some murals, or, I have wonderful ideas for podcast, or having platforms, having community events, you know help helping non-binary people beautify our city. We do it, we're really good at that, you know so providing opportunities for us to shine, to be recognized, to speak. I mean, I'm not a public speaker. I fear public speaking. I just wanted to be here because it's so important, that, how else do I access people in power to say, please protect me too, you know, protect me from, the church that, demonizes me, that kicks me out. I've tried to work in the church since I was, all my life. And as a out queer person, they're like, no, no, despite the need for young people in service, so if city government can influence, the many cross sectors that oppress us systematically, then we'll see a change, and and we won't exist in the shadows.
Wow. I don't even know what to say. This has been um, a learning curve in my end. Thank you very much for sharing your stories and also sharing your knowledge, and also giving us something to think about or take back to our businesses, and think about how to bring the inclusivity in, not only to our businesses but to our daily lives. So I really want to give you guys your flowers and say thank you very much. Is there any closing statements before we say goodbye and say no and see you later?
I just want to say thank you so much for welcoming me into this space. Just as you were asking, like, what can we do? It's this, right? You start by actually, like you were saying, Kiki, hiring, the artists and the different people who are like really caring about this work in the community, because we're here and we want to be, making moves so that we can all feel like we belong here. And so I'm just very grateful to be a part of this conversation. And I hope that this sparks, something for a lot of people where they can really begin to kind of open up their mind, because it really will be a shift in culture, but it really starts with the unlearning process.
And I just want people to be mindful of the intersectionality of our oppression. And if you can see it as it relates to you culturally based on your ethnicity or your race, well, the same mechanisms are operating with how you view gender and people like me, you know. And so I would just really end with that, we are, we really do need to be about allyship and building bridges. And I'm, patient and tolerant and indulgent of what it takes to bring people along. I used to have a pretty impressive goatee that helped frame my little chubby face. And now it's gone because I'm at home with my mom and I have to wear pastels and try, So we're willing to do it, and, to play our part. And so just make the effort in the other direction and don't dismiss, the fact that we need the help of government, we need the help of business, we need the help of the church, our civic groups. We need to be included so that we can live full, healthy, balanced life. And so that's
Awesome. Now, before we close, thank you again. I can't say how much I am grateful for you guys. Um, Please, for everybody else who's listening, Myanmar is the place to do business. Come. If you have any ideas, if you have any webinars, please reach out to us, and then we see how we can facilitate that. Now, looking at the charts and some of the questions that have been asked, will this presentation be shared? What I will say is I'll share the contact to Shaïna, and then from there you guys can hold that conversation. Is that okay? Awesome. And then thank you. This was a very important webinar. The presentation is wonderful, and the host, guest, and moderator of that's me. And I encourage you to continue being the voice for the voiceless. Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. I really appreciate it. This was a great presentation. I appreciate all of you guys. Awesome. And then I have a private message saying, hey, you guys look amazing. We try. I put on my makeup. As you can tell, I put on too much.
My good hat.
So
good watch.
But thank you. Until next time, be good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And thank